Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, and um, hope that your day has gone well and that your evening is going well. I'm Deirdre Mendez. I'm the director of the Center for Global Business here at UT, and we are very fortunate to have a wonderful speaker with us this evening, whom I'm sure you are going to all benefit from hearing from because he has such valuable things to say for people who are interested in having a global career. So, I will give you a little bit of background on our guest speaker, Bill Leasure. He's had a really diverse global background. He actually started his international career as an international trade specialist for African trade at the US Department of Commerce. So he started with government, but he didn't stay there. He moved into the private sector, and um, he has worked for global companies in many capacities across industries and companies. Some of those companies included Box Technologies, NTT Data, which is a Japanese company, Dell, Motorola Mobility, Intel, and more. So he has quite a strong background in technology. Um, and he is currently the COO of ChargeZone, which is a super interesting company. The more I hear about it, the more interesting it gets. This is a global electric vehicle charging company that's actually based in India. So I think we're going to invite him back to talk about ChargeZone at some point because that is a super interesting story. But tonight he is here to talk to us about how he established, how he developed and purposefully pursued and achieved a tremendously global career and great success with multiple companies in multiple industries that were doing international business. So, Bill, welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Deirdre, and thanks for the CGB team, all the team for bringing us all together. I'm really excited to be here with everybody. I mean, these are the future leaders who are going to be doing a lot of the same things I did, navigating markets, cultures, challenges across continents. So it's exciting to be here and share some things with you. Really happy to share some insights that I've come across. A lot that started probably at Austin Bergstrom Gate 18 or something like that. So anyway, a lot of travel and history there. As I was kind of thinking about this, I'm somewhat tempted to tell funny stories internationally because there are some really good stories. But instead of doing that, what I'd like to do is really focus on what would have been really helpful for me early in my career, and things that I wish I would have figured out earlier, perhaps. And to start with that, I'll just tell you like a quick story because actually, after being a trade specialist, I ended up at Intel Corporation, the chip company. And just a quick kind of anecdote to kind of set the stage for things. Um, I think like a lot of all of you, I was pretty diligent about trying to, be prepared, make sense of all the cultural differences, and I traveled a lot to, in this case, European headquarters was in Germany, and so I thought I really was very prepared, and I think to a degree I was, but it's kind of interesting. So after a number of years stateside, I started in Santa Clara, which is Santa Clara, California, which is headquarters, but I transferred over to European headquarters in Munich. And so I was super excited. I'm working on my first marketing campaign. And that was the time where the 486 was just, kind of conquering the world, except we were very well penetrated in the US. But Europe, not so much. So that was kind of my main thing, was to grow the market in Europe. So I did my first campaign, and much like a lot of marketing situations in the U.S., basically you take the product and you list whatever the 5 or 6 top attributes. And at the time, our competitor was AMD, and so I did that for Intel. I did it for AMD, and I, you know, presented my big marketing campaign, and it went totally flat. And so the Europeans looked at me and said, "Bill, that's we kind of frown on that in Europe. We don't do like side by side comparisons like that." So it was just an example of that I think no matter how much we prepare, there are always some blind spots, right? And so I think that was one of the takeaways. And so kind of one of the things that um, really helped me a lot is uh, that was just one instance, and clearly there were a number of other things where I was trying to make sense of basically how do you actually go about conducting business, because since I knew international trade, I knew finance and so forth, but how do you actually sit across the table from somebody and do business? And so one of the things that really helped me, I came across a book from a guy named Al Ries. There's Al Ries and Jack Trout, and he wrote a book called Positioning the Battle for Your Mind. And the reason I mention that is, I think in a number of situations, finding a framework is so important. And for me, what it helped me do is understand how Europeans think, how they evaluate products, how they determine, which is appropriate, and then how they buy things. And so my, one takeaway out of all this is really finding that framework, because I think once you find those kind of tools, it's really, really very helpful. And so that was really instructive to me. And so kind of moving forward in that a little bit. So I think one of the interesting things is what I found, when I was starting my career is, there are tons of books on trade and finance and economic development and so forth. And for some reason, I was really trying to find something that gave me practical advice on how to do business internationally. And at the time, there was so little literature. And the irony is, fast forward all these years, and I don't think it's gotten a whole lot better. So I would really encourage everyone in the IB program to kind of go outside the kind of standard book knowledge and look for people that have traveled a lot, that have gone to a lot of different countries, and find those resources, because frankly, there wasn't a lot. I'd go to a bookstore, I'd say, where do you have any books on international business? And they'd probably point out the same couple of books. So they're always blue hardcover. I don't know why that's the case, but it is the case. And so the point is, on this journey, we're all kind of left a little bit to our own devices to put that together, which is the fun part, but it can also be a little bit of a challenge, and I realize that.
Thank you. Thank you for starting out that way. And I can remember a time in the US when side-by-side comparisons were not considered appropriate. You didn't say 3 times the power of this other product, because that was considered confrontational and kind of rude and so on. You were supposed to simply list the attributes of your product and, hope people would catch on. So yeah, and there are still places in the world where that's considered kind of a combative way to approach things. So that's a great example of a cultural difference that you might not have expected with Germany. Um, and those kinds of things can blindside us so easily. And you and I have talked about this sort of thing quite a lot. Um, And I guess one of my questions is, so you mentioned finding resources, and I like to think that the resources that are available to our students now are much better than they were even 5 years ago. And of course, with AI and all of that, you really can kind of put together a little bit of a playbook. But I think knowing where to start is really challenging. So finding the resources that you mentioned, and then also thinking about maybe how do we get a start? So if you had to advise students on how to begin thinking and then how to move towards things like choosing the employer they're interested in or recruiting and that kind of thing, do you have any immediate thoughts about that?
Yeah, I certainly do. And I think, and again, if I kind of go back to where I was at the beginning of my career, I think that's exactly what I was looking for, because I think what employers really would love to have, the ideal situation, and what they're looking for in particular from the Macombs IB grads is they're looking for global readiness. And so at the time when I was kind of starting out, I really what I wanted was a playbook. That's kind of what I really was hoping for from whatever source, whether it was a book or friends or whatever resource I could find. And so what I came up with is my own playbook. And so it's really there are 4 steps to the playbook. And the way, especially, um, you know, with my career, a lot of it has been in sales and marketing. And I'd say probably my strongest suit is on the marketing side. So the way I would look at your career is really as a marketing campaign, because it's the most important marketing campaign you'll ever have. And so the 4 pieces that I would focus on. So one is corporations run on data. So step one, the first language that you should know is understand data. And it could be, you may have an interest in um, maybe it's economics, maybe it's finance, maybe you're interested in coding, Python, whatever. But I think the key is to make sure that your first language is understanding the role that data plays in a global company. So that's kind of the starting point. And then, and this is really kind of how I navigated. Once I got to Europe, it wasn't, it was European headquarters, but it wasn't clear what where things were going to go from there. But so the second step in the marketing campaign, the way I would do it is basically start to segment your market. And so what I mean by that is, I had basic international skills that may or may not have applied, but the way that I found out whether they applied is I would start thinking about like different regions. Hey, I'm in Germany now. I want to start doing business in Italy or in Spain, or so you start thinking about regions and languages. Obviously, if for example, I'm fluent in French, that opened so many doors. Once I was over in Europe, I would do the press announcements for Intel in Paris, and because they needed somebody that spoke the language. So if you step one, data. Step two is start to think about that regional expertise, whether it's product and services. There's so many different directions that can take. And then step three, much like any product that you're marketing, you want proof points. And a good way to do that, or an ideal situation, would be maybe an internship. So if you take data plus the segmenting the market, and then those proof points. And then the fourth point is really kind of packaging your story. And so the reason that's so critically important is your first job out of the chute is probably not going to be the ideal one. I mean, it might. I mean, there are chances that that could happen, but it's more likely that you're going to need to do a pivot. And so the stage four is kind of that global pivot, and you can show that, hey, I've done this for these products and this situation, and I'm fluent in this language. But basically build that story that, and this is how it applies to what you're doing today. So those are, in my mind, the four critical elements. And again, it's really a marketing campaign. And I have a simple way of thinking about this, and how it all comes together is, kind of imagine that this effort, this marketing campaign, is like a tree. So the data skills that you have, when it doesn't have to be super technical, it can be, um, it can be whatever is of interest to you. But your data skills are like the root, and then the culture part is like the trunk of the tree, right? So as you have, and the reason I say that is culture ties it all together. And then all of these different areas that you might be interested in, or products or services, those are like the leaves of the tree. So it's like it's just a good way of picturing how this could all come together.
Super, thank you. Um, so you secured your first job at some point. Was there a special aspect of getting that job that required global skills, or was it actually getting abroad once you had the job?
It was, I think that it kind of comes back to the original, thing about the side by side comparison. I think that, I my first I had a number of roles where I was traveling a lot and I'm doing business in Asia, but it was not as immersive. Like when once I moved to Germany in European headquarters, it was a whole different deal. And the reason I mentioned that, and this is actually a really, I think, important thing for, kind of a learning, having been there and lived as a European, is, the I'm sure we've all seen like tourists wherever it is that are, somewhat misbehaving. And so my point in all that is, as graduates of the IB program, the just know that the bar is going to be set a lot higher. And the reason that's really critically important is, when I went to Germany and I was working in headquarters, um, I was really a representative of this European team. And so, you know, clearly I'd interface with executives that would come over from Intel all the time, and they were viewed completely differently than I was, because I was now kind of in this immersive, European environment. And so, I think, um, I got a very different perspective, and I think at the end of the day, it's just a certain responsibility that comes with being a graduate of this program, and representing the school, and in this case, it was also the European community.
Right. Okay. And in terms of being sent abroad, were there certain criteria that you needed to have? How did you position yourself at the company you were working for? Was Intel, was that your first international assignment going
It
to
it was
Germany?
it was my first international assignment, and really, at the time, I mean, I'm fluent in French, and I really wanted to go to Paris, but because headquarters was in Munich, I decided to go there instead. And I actually, got there mostly on technical skills, because they really needed, they needed somebody on the ground to promote the product. But it's kind of like, I think that's the um, secret weapon for all of us that have this international desire is once once you're there, doors just really start to open for you. And so one thing that I think is really very important, because there's kind of a counter side to this, and this kind of is a follow on to your earlier question. The the when I first got involved in all this, I was really trying to understand, what are the possible opportunities for me long term, and even before the international assignment, and before getting into Intel, yeah, I was pretty determined to do this. But the a lot of the career advice I had was dangerously challenged, and what I mean by that is, and this I think is a really critical thing for everybody in the IBP program to think about, and that is that um, the talking to my friends and talking to counselors at schools and so forth, the the feedback was mostly like this. It said, take the job with the best salary and the best title. You know, get a brand name on your resume. Now, granted, I did end up at Intel, so that kind of worked out that way. But the other piece of advice was to, hey, you've gone to a prestigious university, you have these degrees, you know, now you need to live the good life and take a glamour role, right? That was kind of the story. But the reason I mention all that is, and where it gets kind of dangerous, is the really, what is more important is a couple of things. One is, actually four things, what I call fast mover advantage. And that is that, if you go to a different environment where you're doing, more meaningful work, for example, you could get to that prestigious company and end up doing PowerPoint for 5 years. Where if you took a little bit of a different tack, you could be doing very meaningful work, negotiating trade deals or meeting with customers, and things that are really going to serve you in your career. And it also applies to what's called SMB, or small medium business segment of the market. So, it's obviously kind of seductive to go for one of these big players, Dell or Nvidia or where, AMD, whatever it is. But some of these small medium business companies can provide better opportunities for you. And so that's another area to really think hard about. And probably the most important part is, what you really need to do is prioritize learning over salary. And the reason I mention that is, especially thinking about myself in the early days, that the extra dollars was always pretty attractive. But the important thing is, like a $5,000 bonus, for example, over a career is nothing really. And so what you really need to do is figure out, what environment you want to kind of plug into, and where you're going to have the most learning. And so there's another piece to this too, which is really kind of base level, kind of tactical. And that is, some companies that say they're doing international business are kind of, the way we would say it in Texas, are fixing to do international business. They're really kind of evaluating markets and studying it and thinking about it, but they're not actually doing it. So, the one really important piece of advice is, as you're talking to companies, be thinking that you're interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you. So questions like, what am I getting? What's the first 90 days? What's the first 180 days look like for me? I mean, even if it's an internship, or, who am I going to be working with, and in those type of things. So I would encourage everybody to be thinking that through is in terms of identifying opportunities. And, we're here to help you if you have any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. One of the things we talk about is the fact that, well, some of the students who are with us this evening will be international business majors, others will be international business minors, and others will simply be here because they are interested in the nature of this talk since we promoted it so widely. So we have students with us from across the university, and I think all of this information applies to everyone, whether they have an IB degree or something else. Um, but one of the things that we talk about is that that recruiters, when they come to campus, are not usually looking for someone to go abroad right away. In fact, that's very unusual because you need to learn the job, you need to learn the company, and you need to be there a little while before they're going to trust you to go abroad and represent them overseas. So, uh, choosing a job that you like, a company that you're willing to stay with for a few years, it's probably going to be a few years before you have that kind of opportunity. But Bill, I'm curious, I know you spoke French. A lot of the executives that I talk with, the global executives, tell me that basically what they did was just let it be known that they were interested in a global role whenever the opportunity arose. And they didn't insist on that from the beginning because no one would have hired them because they weren't going to be sending them abroad right away. But they just let everybody know. And eventually somebody would come up and say, "Oh, well, you studied abroad in Spain. How about going to China for us?" Right? Because a lot of times, and I think this is particularly true of US companies, there's not very much awareness that sort of one study abroad experience isn't the same as every other study abroad experience or whatever, and um, and and so just the fact that you've never been to Asia doesn't necessarily mean you won't get that job, but also. Um, well, I'll let you respond to that, Bill. What is your kind of take on that?
Well, again, we talked briefly about this before, but I think this is kind of the amazing thing about the whole process is, like, you know, uh, I think basically letting people know what your passions are and your interests and all that is so important. And I mean, I would, you know, I'd have friends at Intel. This is before I actually got assigned overseas, but I'd have friends that would say, "Hey, I'm going over to Paris for a weekend," and I'd write up an itinerary and all. In they'd be booking a hotel or whatever. And I say, "Hey, I could do that for you." But people, just a lot of my friends, kind of knew that I was interested in doing this, right? So my, I think there's kind of like this serendipity thing that happens that we don't really realize until we're kind of in the mix. But like my the actual assignment that I got to go to Intel, which was like a dream for me, because I mean, I sat down and planned this out like 5 years in advance, and I actually gave myself a title, so international marketing manager in Germany, five years before, and I picked a salary and I said, "This is my target salary," and 5 years later, I had that exact title and salary. That's I mean, so that's so this serendipity thing really happens. But as much as it sounds like there was some committee that said, "Hey, Bill is the right guy to send to Germany," and all that, what really happened is the vice president of sales at Intel at the time was a guy named Frank Gill, and I sent him like this is I sent him like a 2-line email that said, "Hey, I want to go do this." And I thought, there's no way this is ever going to happen. And he called me up and he goes, "Bill," he goes, we have a need to grow the business in Germany." And that was it. So the making your interests and your passions known with there it goes back to that tree analogy, the embrace of different cultures. if people know that you're really passionate about that and you really want to do it, it'll happen. I, I'm I'm pretty optimistic about all that. It'll happen for, especially the ones that really focus on it and have the drive to keep at it.
Thank you for that. And I know from our previous discussions, you have worked in many, many locations in the world, and you are not familiar with all of those countries and cultures before you went in every case. So, can you describe the skills that you think you either had or that you developed to figure out what was going on and what was appropriate and so on as quickly as possible? I'm sure that early lesson in Germany uh, made you more aware that it was important to kind of understand the cultural context.
Yeah, that's actually that's a really good question. So I'm sure pretty much all of us that have kind of been in the business world have at one point or another come up with, seen like the Peter Drucker culture eat strategy for breakfast, and then it has room left over for dessert, I think, with this. But at any rate, the interesting thing about that is he was really he was really targeting American companies when he said that, right? And so the challenge is exponentially larger going overseas. And so the I think the key insight in that, and this is where it gets like really interesting, is you know some people that you'll work with in your career, and it's like, hey, people are basically the same, and then what works domestically, it's probably going to work overseas, and nothing could be further from the truth, really. And just a few simple examples is what I think as a result of that. So I think it's the once you have kind of the core business down, this whole area of culture is so important, and a lot of it is really being listening to cues, and a lot of it's almost like an art. And so, for example, a few of the key differences is decision making. For let's say you've been working at, in my case, Intel in the U.S., and then you start going overseas, but decision making even throughout the European countries is dramatically different from one country to another. I mean, so like the some are done by consensus, some are very hierarchical. That really you need to like tap into those differences. Another good example is communication styles. One of the big surprises to me is how close Germany is to the US in terms of communication styles. But I spent a lot of time in the Scandinavian countries, and it's very indirect. And so you really have to like understand the cues. And I mean, I have some interesting stories about meetings where it was almost like instead of talking to one or two people, I was talking to the whole group at the same time, because it's that's kind of the way that the Scandinavian countries work, is it's very much consensus building. And then another is, and this is actually a really key difference, is American companies are driven by quarters. And like in the Asian countries, they're driven by generations. And even the German, in Germany, for example, they're thinking about in decades. So if you're not tapped into those kind of time frames, you're not even having the same conversation. So it's I think the really key takeaway in all that is I kind of got to the point where I would put culture first, and then I wouldn't address the business issues until those were solid. And I think another way to look at this is like culture is really the only operating system that you never need to update. That's the way I look at it.
Super. Okay, thank you. And then I have one more question before we start taking questions from the audience, and that is just what kinds of courses, what kind of academic and other types of preparation um, should students try to acquire if they are interested in a global career? And of course, there are courses that you can take in international business and so on. And there are also a lot of other soft skills that you have access to at UT. We just offered our first Export Fellows program, which is available to any UT student to learn about exporting. And there are other programs and courses available. So, Bill, how would you recommend that a student try to organize their academic study and then also acquire the skills that'll be useful to them?
Well, so I think that a good a good way to approach this, I think, and I think in talking to some of the current IB students, I think one of the big challenges is, um, you know, what the way to think about it is what skills are going to be relevant for my target customers in a way. So again, think about it as like that marketing campaign. And so what I mean by that is, and you don't have to get crazy to and go into take a whole slew of different courses in a certain area. However, and I'll give you a good example is, um, let's say that you really like talking to customers. You want to be on the front line, and when you talk about business, you're like you want to be the deal maker, as an example, right? That's very different than if you just like you want to be the analyst and behind the scenes. Both of those are totally fine, right? But my point in all that is I think even at this stage of the game, you're going to kind of know enough about your personality and things you like to do, right? And so for example, if you're um, customer oriented, you like doing that kind of thing, it would probably be a really good idea to get some basic like sales skills, just kind of understand the sales process, but basically start to hone on things. And in fact, it might be a good idea to, at this point, list out like 8 to 10 companies that could be of interest to you and start thinking about what would be of interest to them. So that's where it ties back to what I was talking about before, the playbook. So data, start with some kind of database. You look at segmenting the market, some proof points, but this area is where you pivot. So you start to, because at the end of the day, it isn't about just finding an opportunity. It's finding the one that's really going to speak to you, and that includes nonprofits. It includes all kinds of different, entrepreneurial things. It could be anything, but I would start. And actually, there is one other thing I wanted to point out, and this is, I think, very important. It is, um, and I've seen this in a lot of times in my career, is a lot of newer, you know, students or interns or whatever starting out. I think in the back of your mind, you're thinking, well, I'm going to start contributing once I kind of know the drill here and I know kind of the, what's really important to this company. I would actually look at it totally in the reverse. And the way I like to look at it is start today to put together what I call a point of view. And what I mean by a point of view is, start to think about how you would, what would you, how do you feel about things? Or if, let's say, if you're thinking about, use Dell as a good example. If you were interested in going to work at Dell and as in some capacity, have a point of view of, you know, where growth opportunities could be, where the markets are going, where opportunities are. That the earlier you start that point of view, from my standpoint, I think it's critically important. And the reason for that is, as a manager, um, when I see new hires and interns or whoever they are, I'm very interested to know what they think, right? Because if you get into a situation where it says, "Hey, that's the way we've always done things," I want somebody to come in and say, "Hey, have you thought about this?" And it doesn't matter who they are or what their title is or where they come from. It's that's critically important. So at the end of the day, my advice is start thinking about your point of view, because it can become very important very quickly.
Oh, I really love that, and I think it's a great place to leave our conversation and start looking at what some of the questions are, because there have been some really interesting questions here, and I know you'll have great answers for them. So there are a couple of questions about AI. One is, how will AI affect the future of international business? That's a super broad question, but there's another question about AI and culture. Now that we have AI, are there do we even need to know about other cultures? Will AI kind of take care of that for us in some way? I did not represent that question very well. Uh, I will look for it again, but please tell us what you think about AI and international business.
Well, so as I mentioned before, I think you know, the we're not going to be replaced by AI. It's um, the professionals that learn how to use AI will replace those that don't have that capacity. But I think the more important thing is, well, one is when it comes to languages. I've seen like these earpieces you can wear, and you speak in English and it translates to French and all that. Okay, that I see happening. Um, the, Really, the one thing that will never happen is something that can pick up on these cultural nuances, because it's so difficult to do that. But where the way I would look at AI is, look at your basically look at your career as a machine, and your and AI can be very useful if you're basically completely continue to debug the program, and you with your learnings you feed it back into so think about your careers machine. You keep feeding like those learnings back in, and it makes you better the next time out, right? And just think about the kind of improvements you can have. But just as one quick example of this cultural thing, that how interesting it can become. So I was in India, and I at one point I was director of technology strategy for Motorola, and I would sign up telecommunication providers. I was in India, and this is why culture cannot be um, fed into AI. I was in a meeting, and they served us tea, and I'm we were negotiating this big deal. There was a whole team of us, or probably a dozen people, and the host sat next to me, and we're like 40 minutes into this discussion, and it was a good deal for both sides, and he just became very, very agitated. And it's like, geez, what am I doing? And like about 40 minutes in, and he just kept looking over at me. It's like, geez, what am I doing? And he goes, Bill, he goes, you haven't touched your tea the whole time. And I mean, so my point in all that is, these little cultural nuances, that's not something that can be done by AI. And it's something it's a lived experience, and humans just aren't built that way.
Right. Don't we wish we had a little machine on our, that we could look at it, on our maybe on our phone that says, "Hey, Bill, drink your tea."
By the way, I did drink the tea and we did get the deal. So
You
it
can
was
recover, in other words.
the cooked tea was cold though. That was the bit downside. But
All right. Well, I love that story. And especially since I teach intercultural management, I'm always reminding people that business is done by humans with other humans. And there's an awful lot of diversity in everybody's thinking and behavior. And yeah, I would certainly agree with you. And I think that's a great example. Okay. So we have a very nice question here from Elise. When companies are looking for people for international roles, what kind of experiences or skills do you think really show someone can succeed in a different culture besides just studying abroad?
um, well, clearly, as I mentioned, internships are awesome because it shows that it comes back to that the playbook I mentioned. You want proof points, and those can come from anywhere, right? And I think, um, I mean, I happen to think that like just understanding sales a little bit actually helps a lot because um, what you've what you can find is it's application of those skills in an international environment. And so I think what you want to do, and this kind of comes back to the tree analogy, like building on you know segmenting your market and expanding the products or services, whatever. But I think the skills that are really important is to show that you can kind of build out that tree. And so what I mean by that is you take, obviously we're all getting these basic business skills, whether it's sales, marketing, whatever it is, right? The but it's showing that you can apply those skills in a new environment. And I mean, you'd be amazed at how successful that can be. And you know, really, I think if you really driven and really passionate about it, if you can show that, for example, you can be successful in a marketing campaign in Paris, it's pretty easy to come up with a story that shows that you can do that in Italy, or in Rome, whatever. So I think what you want to do is it's that whole you know building on layers, show it, use those fundamental skills, and show that you can apply them. And I think that's the key.
And Bill, thank you. We've got a number of questions that sort of relate to what about the sort of the interpersonal skills and that sort of thing? Because of course there are people with great resumes who may have studied abroad and done international internships and so on and so forth that you would never trust to lead a global team or represent your company abroad. So what do you look for?
Well, so personally, I think, and I think this is true for most places. I think the word I would use is cultural sensitivity, because I think it's easy to um, obsess about. I personally, when I look at my own situation, I will always want to learn as much about the language as I can, because I think language is like opens the door to this world that is exciting, and you're never going to get there without learning some of that. However, that's actually not necessary. I think if you have the cultural sensitivity to tune into those key factors, like how are decisions made, is this consensus, is what is the time horizons. But if you do both together, it's a superpower. So I think if you combine language, but they don't necessarily have to go together. But again, cultural sensitivity is, um, really means you can tune into how things actually get done, and that's really critical.
All right, thank you. And what about sort of attitude? What do you how cultural sensitivity as a manager, someone comes to you and says, I want to work abroad. What would you be looking for? What can our students seek to demonstrate in their interaction with their managers and so on with each other with their work colleagues that would indicate that kind of cultural sensitivity?
Well, so I think the easiest way to answer that, is kind of going back to what I said is the point of view, because the it's not even necessarily a, skill set or experience, but I think that if you show, that if you can show that you think strategically, that's a skill that is very rare, actually. And if you can show that, and you have a point of view, and the beauty of it is you can be changing your point of view all the time. It doesn't really matter. It's just a matter of having one. But a real, and a, a really, big uh, kind of shocking thing in a way for me is, because I worked at Intel and then later, years later ended up working at Dell. But the one of the, surprising things when I got to Dell is, Michael Dell in particular was having a difficult time getting people to go international, to go overseas. And so the thing to really think about is just how rare and valuable those skills are. And the if you, basically put that together with having your own point of view, and the point of view may be, hey, have you thought about, you know expanding in, in Thailand, whatever it is. And then it shows that you are thinking strategically, and you can really help the company. That's what I would look for first.
Okay, thank you. So I'm looking at three here that are really similar or related that I'm trying to kind of synthesize into one. So, what's a skill that you wish you had had sooner? Uh, and another is, are you aware of mistakes that young people are making, as that are our students in particular are making? I don't think you've mentored some of our students. I don't know if you haven't hired any of them to date, but so maybe you can speak to that a little bit. And then an interesting one is, what was the defining point when you felt you were stable in your career, and what were some of the things that you did in the early part of your career that got you there? So just sort of skills and aptitudes, and how did you make it happen?
Those are all good questions. So if I miss one, let me know. But I'm not going to name any names. But at any rate, I think one of I, the and this is actually, frankly, a big mistake that I made is, in particular on the international business side. I was, I actually got like really excited about doing this when I was back in sophomore in high school. I mean, it really goes back that far. But I think because, I did a trip to Europe, and, you know, my eyes were open, and it just is like, wow, this is really what I want to do. But it took me a few years to get, to really put it all together. But the skill that I wish I had, so this comes back to my playbook, is, I was very cultural heavy and business light. And so I think that, in some ways, I thought like, I talked about the cultural sensitivity, which early on I had in spades, but um, but the part that I didn't have is an like one or two key areas like were really my areas of expertise. So ironically, where it all came together was being an African trade specialist because I know is I actually wrote a one of the government publications on how to do business in Africa. So I learned exporting, I learned international trade. So that was kind of the bridge to all of it. But again, I think that um, you know I was a little bit too heavy on the cultural side early on, and just because I loved languages and so forth. But so I think the other piece that what were some of the other questions? It was remind me.
So a skill. So what was a skill you wish you'd had early on, and it would have been a more of a technical skill?
More technical skill.
Okay, and then a mistake that students make.
Yeah, so I think and this is actually I think a very common thing, and I think one of the key things, if you kind of go back to the playbook, and you look at it as a campaign, I think and this is a really hard one actually. I think the if I mentioned technical skill, segment your market, proof points, and then basically package your story. So I think the big challenge is packaging the story because that really takes a lot of thinking time, to do that. And so the reason that's super important is if you don't do that, then you may be not in the right place. You may be like in an internship that you don't like, or you might be, working for whatever, like an oil and gas company, and you really just don't like that business, whatever it is, right? But I think it's just an important skill in life is to know when to pivot, and I think that there's in a way there's nothing wrong with that, right? I think finding out what you don't like is probably as important as pretty much anything. And so really thinking about it as a marketing campaign is something that I think is just it's a big challenge, but that's a very very important skill.
All right, super. Um, let's see. Maybe we have time for one more. Well, let's end with a story since you have so many good stories. What is an example of a cultural misunderstanding you've experienced, and what did you learn from it? So this would be a different example than we've heard.
Okay, let me see. Oh geez. Um, well, a good example is, I mentioned Scandinavia, and here's this is a really good example. So we did a design for, and it just shows you the sensitivity. But we did a design for Nokia, and it was a really kind of very cool prepackaged design from Intel, and I actually I was in Munich, and I got this first ever. It was like this very integrated, very cool new laptop that we did. And so I carried it up through security, went up to Sweden, and so the reason I mentioned this is it was a very awkward meeting because I got there, and it turns out that we had sent all the design specs, everything in advance, and there was this one young gentleman, kind of a new hire at the company, and it was clear that he just made a basic design mistake, right? But the reason I mention that is, you know, we were there basically to enable them, right? But all of a sudden, I mean, it was like everybody, because there was about a dozen people in the room, and there I was there with Intel and the Intel sales guy, and all of a sudden everybody in the room realized that there was a basic design mistake that this young lad had made, right? But what the reason I mentioned it is what happened next was kind of surprising to me because everybody in the room came to his defense. And it was, if that would have happened in the US, there would have been shouting. I mean, Andy Grove would have fired somebody, whatever, right? But it just goes to show you that, these cultural nuances are real. And it was actually one of the most awkward meetings I've ever been in. And on the one hand, but it was also like really cool in a way to see how they weren't going to let somebody take the bullet, right? So it's pretty fascinating, some of the and there's so many stories like that. I mean, in different ways, and I'm sure you kind of have seen a lot of the same things, but that really makes you appreciate that at the end of the day, you know AI is not going to solve those kind of things. um, we're still human beings, and the cultural things that happened at the beginning of my career, they have changed so little. And so it's a matter of just tapping into that. It and if you tap into it, it's the mother lode, right? It really is. And you'll never have to look for a job again. That's kind of the upside.
Well, wow, that's a very upbeat and inspiring ending to our presentation. I want to thank you so much for everyone who asked a question. Bill touched on so many different things, and I'm sorry I couldn't get them all asked, but I hope that you got at least part of your question answered. And Bill Leasure, I can't thank you enough for sharing information and stories and lessons learned from your um, very, very global career. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Deirdre, and hook 'em. Thank you, everybody.